All right, we're back. This is the third of three sort of mini units dealing with discrimination for constitutional history. And this is, we just took a look at Yikwo versus Hopkins. We looked at the Korematsu. We were looking at the history of sort of Indians and reservations. And then we're about to take a look at the Cherokee. So here's where we are. This brings us to this really interesting case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Everything was coming to a head in this part of the country in the 1820s and 30s. And so some were looking to the Supreme Court to kind of decide the state of the nationality, the nature, and the sort of land issues related to Cherokee, but Native Americans in general. Some people didn't really care about the Supreme Court. As you know, a lot of white settlers were just kind of taking over the land, and it didn't really seem to matter that much whether that was legal or not. It was kind of frontier justice, frontier mentality. And frankly, to Jackson, it didn't seem to matter either, as we'll see in a moment. So, but in 1831, as far as we're concerned, where the Constitution really matters, we see, of course, in the case, the Supreme Court acknowledging the tension between federal and states. This is before the Civil War, of course, which one of the issues at play with the Civil War was, of course, slavery, but also are we a confederation or a union? And so they acknowledged that. This is a few decades before the Civil War. Obviously, the states get some sovereignty, and the federal government gets some sovereignty as well. And America's always been kind of complicated when it comes to that. So in this particular case, they looked at the Georgia forced tribal removal that was going on in the state of Georgia, and they looked at how constitutional that is, and they of course dealt with these issues that we're looking at right now. What the Supreme Court said in 1831 was kind of interesting. It might not surprise us. It might it didn't seem to surprise a whole lot of people at the time, and maybe what we know about the way this was going in the 1830s, looking back on it, probably doesn't surprise us either. But again, always the question is, what's the constitutional logic here? What is it the Supreme Court saying, and why? So the Cherokees, in this particular case, they said they declared themselves an independent nation. They had a constitution, just like the United States. So they couldn't really be citizens, necessarily. We can have dual citizenship. But what the issue was is not so much can they be a citizen of the United States, it's are they citizens of another nation? Well, if they have their own constitution, their own leadership, they recognize the heads of state of other countries, and other countries recognize them, then they're kind of a foreign country, right? So the first question put to the court was, in this case, was, are Cherokees a political state? And to which the Supreme Court said, yes, they are. They're responsible for treaties. They're recognized by the United States government, going back to the Treaty of Canandaigua and many others in between. Yeah, so yes, they are definitely a political state. But are they a foreign state? And here's an interesting answer. No, the Supreme Court said they're a political state, but they're not a foreign state. But they're not completely foreign. It's not like Great Britain foreign. So they say, this is where it gets very complicated. They say it's a highly unique relationship, but not dependent on state authority. They see this as a relationship of a ward to guardian. So basically like a foster child to a parent. And so, yes, they're independent, they're autonomous, but they're not fully autonomous. They're not equals. You could see in that decision the Supreme Court voicing a mentality that was pretty popular at the time, pretty common, that as advanced as these people might have been, they just couldn't come to terms with them being as civilized as Americans. And some of that's myth, some of that's just perception, of course, but obviously sometimes perception is reality. And without getting into all this, Andrew Jackson was prepared to just ignore what the Supreme Court said, which led to, there's this big thing called the nullification crisis, which we won't get into. But theoretically, one branch of the government, the executive, could ignore the decision of the Supreme Court. We've not really had a major crisis related to that, thankfully, because I'm not quite sure how that would fly, what would happen of that. But in any case, the Supreme Court basically decided this way, which led to the state of Georgia allowing more of this forced removal, which led to thousands and thousands of Cherokees being relocated to Oklahoma Territory, and many of them died along the way. So the last slide related to natives here, I think it's the last slide, slide or two, I guess, has to do with what's called the Dawes Act. So there, as you know, the story didn't end there, and as westward expansion continued, we looked to the federal government to kind of figure out exactly what the terms were for this, because each state and each territory was kind of unique. That's kind of part of the character of American identity. And so this Dawes Act by the federal government in 1887 created these homestead grants for natives to become citizens. There's like a pathway to citizenship, but they weren't full-fledged citizens at the time. So this eventually led to kind of like holding territories and greatly diminished territory from what's previous. And many states adopted these areas, consider them like ghettos. And by the way, if you're interested in that, you can see kind of an animated map over the century. I'm posting this on Moodle for this week. You can click through that and take a look, and you can see what I mean about how the land was started as native sovereignty and eventually became almost evaporated by the end of the century. So think of these as ghettos, if you will, more or less de facto discrimination. There's some freedom that they could leave, but then they would have to abide by laws that they might not agree with or that might not value them. And for the next 150 to 200 years, even to the present day, of demographic groups in America, they've had the highest rate of alcoholism, poverty, and illiteracy. So there's definitely a baked-in de facto discrimination part of that. And a slight degree of freedom and autonomy, too, as you might expect, because some of these reservations, which are subject to the state laws surrounding them, are also, in some cases, free of federal taxes. And so you have these situations where you have casinos and gas stations that don't have to pay the state tax. So the short story of this kind of trend in American history was that the reservations generally are subject to state law surrounding, and the states have the right to negotiate with them. However, they have their own autonomy. They have their own legal systems and their own jurisdictions. And so it's kind of a unique situation. And just finally here, I believe you read, you might recall the Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock case, which dealt with one of these treaties from the 19th century and asked it to be updated. And basically what this case was looking at was whether the Fifth Amendment provision for government seizure of land applies to native land, right? So this is important to know as westward expansion continued. And by 1903, of course, it's almost much of that land had already been taken up. Of course, in the Southwest and in parts of Wyoming and Arizona and such, that was still continuing on into the early 20th century. Part of one of the things that the Supreme Court said in this case, of course, which is relevant here, is that if there needs to be a change to some of these federal treaties, they have to go through the legal and traditional channels, and that is through Congress, not through courts. There needs to be some sort of amendment or constitutional legislation, and that's the legitimate means for changing these treaty laws. again, they reiterated the Cherokee principle of the wards of the federal government. And there was so much dissatisfaction throughout the 20th century with the treatment of Indians, forced removal, and then I remember in the interstate systems throughout the states, such as like Route 17 in the southern tier of New York State was taken over in the mid 1970s by armed militias from native populations. Some of these organized in a militant group in the 1970s called AIM, the American Indian Movement, to reclaim their land. Some of them violently, some of them in protest or non-violently. But it really forced the issue of this controversy about the relationship between federal and state forces and native sovereignty. So the last slide I have here for you in this, we looked at immigration, we looked at Chinese, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and now we're going to take a look at alienage. Well, an interesting case dealing with this, a leading case, is Truax versus Reich. And in this case, the Supreme Court was asked this question: is it constitutional for a state to require a quota for citizens employed in a company? So what precipitated this was a company that required a certain percentage of American employees to be hired that were American citizens. And obviously there's a controversy there. There are differences of opinion. And what the Supreme Court decided in 1915 was no, it's not constitutional for a state to do that. And this is greatly simplified. But again, just giving you the highlights of this, and you can look at this case for yourself, that the main reason in the majority opinion is that equal protection, the 14th Amendment clause, you'll see this time and time again when it comes to discrimination, that clause extends to residents, not just citizens. We were taking a look at this earlier with the previous case, that it's not just people who are born in America, who are naturalized as citizens, it's anyone in the country has the constitutional right for equal protection. So basically, all people within a territorial jurisdiction are entitled to due process, right? So this also includes detainees. This includes, theoretically, people who are flying over the country and they crash land in the country. They still are covered by the equal protection due process clauses of the Constitution. So there's the state versus federal issue again, too. And so two last little things here related to that kind of update this. The term alienage itself, national origin, like where your parents came from, is immediately suspect, and we see this in the case Graham versus Richardson in 1971, that the very term written into law or legal action that classifies people differently is immediately suspect and should not be taken terribly seriously. Immediately it sends a red flag for people looking at the constitutionality of that. And the last one is this. It's quite interesting, and I can see how there might be a controversy about this. Plyler versus Doe, and whenever you see Doe, it means that this person didn't want to reveal their name, even in these court documents. So in 1982, they found that a state can't deny free public education to undocumented children, of which there are many. There are huge amounts of undocumented children who are living here illegally, who, according to Plyler and Doe and the principles argued by the majority opinions in 1982 and subsequent cases, again, the constitutional principles of fairness, of justice, due process, and equal protection apply to people, again, who live here or are visiting here, who are not citizens. So that seems to be a pretty strong message. And again, in the current administration, there's been pushback on that, and we'll see where that lands in the near future. But that tension will probably continue one way or the other. Herein ends this part of the sort of micro unit on discrimination. I'll put together another couple videos that deal with racial discrimination, and you can take a look at those next. All right, thanks.